52 out of 153 registered voters cast their ballots. And I'm sure that that one missing voter has since been appropriately reminded of his civic responsibility. Tim Hibbitts and Bob Moore are with us today to share their post-election analysis of both state and national races, including some of the more controversial ballot measures, such as Ballot Measure 9 and term limitations. Tim Hibbitts, to my near right, is president and owner of TH Research and a political analyst for KATU TV. He has conducted political and survey research in the Northwest for the past 16 years. He has polled for dozens of campaigns ranging from congressional and statewide races and ballot measures to legislative and municipal elections, in addition to doing corporate work. Bob Moore is president of More Information, Inc., a public opinion research firm that he founded in 1981. From 1977 to 1980, he was the executive director of the National Republican Senatorial Committee when Republicans won control of the U.S. Senate for the first time since 1952. He has been deeply involved in legislative activity and public opinion research in connection with Senator Packwood's office, as well as numerous other political races and ballot measures. Tim Hibbitts will speak first, followed by Bob Moore, and please join me in welcoming both of them to the City Club.
Good afternoon. I know that you folks enjoy having Bob and I here so that after each election we can come back and explain why most of what we told you was going to happen before the election was wrong. Before I get started, I do owe an apology to two particular groups for the last time that I was here. Those of you with sharp memories might recollect that the last time Bob and I were here, I described the Democratic Party as the New Jersey Nets of presidential politics. Well, the Democrats won this year, and the Nets made the playoffs. So maybe that was kind of a warning that things were going to be different this year. I'd like to talk a little bit about both national trends and what I think came out of the election, and also some of the trends in Oregon and some things we might consider for the rest of the 90s. First, looking at the national situation, what I call the Clinton mandate and the fractured electorate. Bill Clinton was elected president with about 43% of the popular vote, actually the smallest percentage for a winning candidate since Woodrow Wilson in 1912. He was also elected with a very, what I describe, again, fractured electorate that had a great deal of different concerns or different driving factors which motivated them in voting. Being a plurality winner in a race is a very dangerous thing in some respects, and if you don't believe me, you could ask Barbara Roberts, who won with 46% of the vote and is now in pretty tough shape as an incumbent office holder. There are examples that you could suggest that would take you both ways. Woodrow Wilson, who won with barely 41% of the vote, in fact wound up to be a very activist and strong president who came in curiously enough, in a dynamic in which 3/4 of the voters had rejected the Republican incumbent. In this election, about 62% of the voters rejected the Republican incumbent, if you throw in the Perot voters as well. But we've got conflicting desires in this electorate that's going to make it tough, I think, for Bill Clinton. First is, you've got to look at what made up each voting group. Basically, the Clinton voters were economically driven and clearly change-driven voters. You look at the Ross Perot voters, and the issues that primarily drove them were the federal deficit and the reform of the political process generally. There was a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction among Perot voters with the system as it now stands. That's going to be hard for Clinton to get a handle on because the more he has to deal with politics as usual and the more he has to deal with the Washington animal as it is, the less he's going to look like a government reformer. I think Clinton's an extremely accomplished politician, but he's going to have to go through, I think, more hoops than my parakeet does to get this one, to get this job done. I don't think the Republicans are going to be very likely to cut Bill Clinton much slack over the long haul or even the midterm as well. They'll make a little bit of noise about being cooperative and helpful to the president where they can, but I think Bob Dole's immediate post-election comment really was more telling, in which he said, we're going to represent the 57% of the voters that didn't vote for Bill Clinton. Clinton also has to deal with the stresses in his own party between liberals and moderates. And this stress shouldn't be overplayed, but it's well worth recalling what happened to Jimmy Carter in 1979 when the liberal wing of the Democratic Party declared war on their own incumbent president. The Democrats lost by a landslide in 1980. In many respects, I was most interested by the Perot showing than anything else, both because he scored so well, but also because he scored so much below where perhaps he could have been. The 19% that he received was the strongest showing for a third-party candidate since 1912 and the second strongest ever. But again, the Perot movement is mainly glued together by disaffection with the political system and by an attraction to Ross Perot, as well as a desire among some of his voters for serious political reform. I think that a good Clinton presidency, a reasonably successful Clinton presidency, and political reform really will remove the drive for a third party. I think a mediocre or a failed presidency by Bill Clinton is going to open the floodgates to a third party in 1996. And I think if you thought the Perot showing was something this year, whether it's Perot or someone else, you may not, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, you ain't seen nothing yet. But the bottom line is what I would say here is I think Bill Clinton, not Ross Perot or anyone else, holds the key to a third party. The Republicans face critical problems on their own, and one of the things I wanted to bring up is in the national political newsletter that I've gotten, I've seen a lot of articles, I've seen a lot of articles recently about splits in the Republican Party and actually two Republican parties being formed. In Harris County, Texas, which I believe is the Houston area, the two wings of the Republican Party, the so-called moderate conservative wing versus the evangelical right wing, have split, and they now have two separate party groups. Just yesterday in Minnesota, the independent Republican Party split between a pro-life and a pro-choice wing. We've seen, those of you who obviously are interested in politics have been following the machinations here of the OCA versus the, if you want to call it the Berkman or the moderate conservative wing of the party, in which the Republican chairman has threatened to leave his own party and form a third party. I'm convinced that the Buchanan-Robertson wing of the Republican Party did George Bush and the Republican Party terrible damage at the convention with what I would call, and others have called, their red meat speeches, describing the country as being on the edge of a cultural war. Like Abraham Lincoln said, that a house divided against itself can't stand, I think the Republicans are going to have a very hard time finding a leader who can glue the two wings of that party back together. And again, what divides them is fundamentally not economic issues, it's fundamentally cultural issues, and that's a very hard bridge to paper over. I don't see too many Ronald Reagans out there at this point who are going to be able to smooth over those two wings. Again, they need someone with the style of a Reagan, and I don't see anyone like that on the horizon now. Now, the possible scenarios for what's going to happen in the next few years are endless. In fact, you could have a kind of a cottage industry of political scenarios. A successful Clinton presidency absorbs the Perot forces, and you see presidential realignment and an end of the Republican presidential era. Failed Clinton presidency, and you could see some kind of Republican revival. You could see the Republican Party fracture. Moderate conservatives join the Perot forces or some other amorphous group and form a new Republican Party, and Republican cultural conservatives split to form their own party. Finally, a possible failed Clinton presidency, voter disgust with both parties, leads to a broad-based third party with a chance to win in 1996. Along that line, again, some of you may have noticed or seen small news articles that a new party has actually been formed that is not aligned with the Peroistas, called the Independence Party, and Governor Lowell Weicker of Connecticut, former Republican and third-party presidential candidate John Anderson, and a smattering of others held an organizing convention earlier, I believe this week, and have now formed what they call the Independence Party. Again, I still think that all of these parties, their success rises or falls much more on what Bill Clinton does than on anything else. Now, turning to Oregon in 1992 elections, what did we learn? Well, the first thing I would tell you is that we learned that the OCA is here to stay, at least for the next several years. They represent a significant minority of Oregon voters who are prepared to be politically active, and they believe very deeply in their causes, and I don't believe that the standard of losing election, that is the kind of the general sense of, gee, we lost, people don't agree with this, really applies with this group. I think they're going to be tinkering and trying again, for example, to pass a more successful Measure 9, or a Measure 9 that they think can pass. I think they'll be tinkering to attempt to pass restrictive abortion legislation. I don't believe they'll be successful with that, but I think they could well be successful with some kind of retooled Measure 9. Expect more social initiatives on homosexuality, abortion, etc. Some will be local, such as the Springfield Initiative. They'll go to areas where they think they can pass these measures. And also, by the way, expect a WCA, an ICA, an MCA, perhaps a YCA, and in essence, you're going to see, I think, these citizen alliances forming in a lot of different states. And by WCA, I meant Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, et cetera. Wherever there's fairly fertile ground and you have a root of voters who have the cultural beliefs that the OCA members evidently do, you have fertile ground for them to grow an organization there. Not necessarily a majority organization, but an organization that can be active politically. They'll be obviously more active in downstate and rural areas. Lynn County is a great example of a place where there are very sharp divisions between on these cultural issues as opposed to the more urbanized areas. But they'll also have a presence here in Portland as well. One of the other things I noticed that was interesting was the urban-rural split between the two Oregons. I think we're seeing them polarize more than I've seen in the past. It's always been there, but I think this election sharpened those differences. One of those being on Measure 9, where Measure 9 was defeated in the more urbanized counties, and in the Bob Packwood-Lesacoin Senate race was a classic example where Packwood not only defeated Lesacoin, but really Aucoin was not even competitive in the downstate timber counties and most of the eastern Oregon counties. The kind of margins Bob Packwood rolled up were 65, 70% in those counties. And I think that was basically driven on natural resource issues, and I think Packwood was tremendously successful in exploiting that wedge. I think the intensity of that split in Oregon is increasing. Again, the polarization between rural and urban Oregon. And I think that's in a general line with the polarization and fracturing of the body politic that we're seeing in a lot of places now in the country. And it's important to keep in mind that because something comes apart, that doesn't mean it may not contract again. If I could use sort of the concept of the expanding and contracting atom or universe, there are times in our country's history or in a state's history when you're going to see coalitions break apart and fly apart, again, the kind of the concept of the expanding universe, and you're going to see other times when they contract. My guess is that we're going to be in one of those times for the next few years where you're going to see more fractionalization and polarization than we'll see the reverse. Now, finally, one other issue I think is going to be important for Oregon in the 90s is growth. Expect explosive growth in the years ahead in Oregon, mostly from California. And one of the things I think that's most interesting about that is in the past when Americans have moved, they have fundamentally moved for economic reasons. If the economy is bad in Ohio, you move to Texas. If it's bad in North Carolina, you move to Mississippi, if it's better there, for example. Now we're seeing what I would call almost social emigres, where people, in particular in California, that the lifestyle has gotten to a point and the quality of life has gotten to a point there where people are fleeing not because they don't have a job, but because they can't stand to live there anymore, or don't feel that it's an appropriate climate to raise their family or to build a future. And I think that's different and not something that I've really seen too much of in American politics before. Politically, then, the impact on Oregons will be significant. Now, that's not to say that they'll change the voting patterns of the state, because it's important to remember that a state like California and Oregon have actually, believe it or not, much in common in terms of the political climate and the way in which they vote. It also depends on where these folks settle. If, for example, retirees settle heavily in southern Oregon, and they are all of one type political mind, then they can change the political climate or the makeup of that particular area. But my guess is you're going to have a balance of folks. You're going to have retirees, you're going to have younger folks with families coming in, and the impact will not be so much that, gee, Californians are coming here or someone from another state is coming here and changing the makeup of the state per se. What they're doing is adding to the population of the state, increasing the growth strains in the state. So I think it'll be more of a social, at this point at least, than a political aspect. And you heard it here first, so if I come back in 2001, this is another prediction you can give me a bad time on. I think we'll have enough growth in this state in this decade that we'll see a 6th congressional seat, that Oregon will pick up a 6th seat in the year 2000. The final point I did want to make is that I still believe, after watching this year's campaigns, that negative campaigns are effective. And I think the best example of that is Senator Packwood's unceasing and tremendously effective attack on Lesacoin, really from prior to the primary all the way through the general election. I'm convinced that was a determining factor in allowing Bob Packwood to return for a 5th term, and I do believe that we'll see a great deal more of that and not less of it as we go through the rest of the decade. Thank you.
I guess I'd have to say almost 3 weeks after the election, I'm a little bit confused. You know, 3 weeks ago, Bill Clinton was telling us how bad the economy is. Bush was saying, oh, well, you know, it's not that bad. Give us a break. Well, this week I read in the paper that somebody in the Clinton campaign is saying the economy isn't that bad after all. And I talked to a friend of mine at the White House who's at the same time telling me, boy, it's really tough out there finding a job. This recession is... So it's not only, I think, the voters that are volatile in their opinions. I think the campaigns are probably volatile. Tim already mentioned the problem of standing up here and telling you what we think is going to happen in a couple of years ahead. You know, in our business, we always tell the customer that the data we give you is a snapshot in time, and it's only good for the day that we give it to you. And believe me, this year they believed us. Tim talked primarily about the politics, and I thought I'd take a little bit different tack and talk a little bit about the process, because I think we saw some differences in the presidential election and on down the line this year as opposed to 1988. And I'm going to draw upon a survey done last week by LA Times with a specific purpose of finding out what voters thought about the election. And it's interesting to me that basically voters were more pleased with this past election than they were in 1988. For example, 77% felt that they had learned enough about the candidates to make an intelligent decision this year. In 1988, only 59% said they had. Voters were also more impressed with themselves, campaign participants, political parties, pollsters, and the press than they were 4 years ago. In fact, they were almost impressed with everybody in the system than they were in 1988. And I think it was related to a couple of things. One, there was also a feeling out there that issues played a more important role. I think this year, or I know this year in the survey, they found 59% saying that they thought issues were very important in terms of deciding who they were going to vote for, while in 1988 only 34% felt that issues played a major role. The debates also were perceived more important. This year, 70% said the debates were more helpful in helping them make a decision versus just 48% in 1988. The increased satisfaction overall among the electorate was principally found among younger voters, those under age 50. And a very important difference in this race is the increased number of younger voters. In Oregon, we found in our polls about 32% of the voters age 32% of the voters were aged 18 to 34 in this election. 1988, it was only 27%. So increased number of the voters this year were young. I guess, you know, George Bush tried to get those baby boomers involved with Dan Quayle in '88, but it didn't happen until Clinton, until he got 2 baby boomers on the ticket. I assume that's the only reason. There were some other interesting comparisons between 1992 and 1988 in the poll. Clinton voters feel better about themselves today than Bush voters felt after the election in 1988 by an 81 to 68% margin, fairly significant. But at the same time, Bush's 92 supporters were not as depressed as Dukakis's 88 supporters, maybe for good reason. Now, I told you that voters were more impressed with almost all of the participants in the election. I thought you'd also find it interesting to find out who they were most impressed with and who they were least impressed with. At the top, Bill Clinton and the voters themselves, closely followed by the Democratic Party in terms of who they thought did the best job. In a second category were Ross Perot and pollsters. I'm not sure I like being in the same category with Ross Perot, but it's better than the third category. In the third category, they put talk show hosts, the press, political consultants, and I'm sure the members of the press are happy to be thrown in with political consultants. And then at the bottom, in that third category, was George Bush and the Republican Party. Now, we had the same order in 1992 than we had in '88, except in '88, Bush and the Republican Party were at the top, and Dukakis and the Democrats were at the bottom. Otherwise, the press and the talk show hosts and everybody else followed the same order, which was, I thought, pretty interesting. A couple of other final notes on the LA Times survey. More people made their mind up about who to vote for in the last week of the campaign this year than in '88, 24% versus 15%, which I think is typical when you have younger voters coming to the polls. And then finally, the vice presidential candidates had no impact on decision making. Now, let me step back 1 minute to polls, which is a subject that Tim and I are very interested in. Initially, when we were called to do this, we were asked to talk about what impact polls have on voters. And both Tim and I pleaded we can answer that with one word, so that would be a pretty short talk, and so I'll answer it. In terms of direct impact, I don't think the polls have any direct impact on the voters. The thing that has been the most, I think, impressive revelation to me in 12 years in the business is really how independent-minded the voters are. I mean, despite all of the noise and everything going on in the election and all the other factors coming into an election, voters basically make up their mind on their own. So in terms of direct influence, polls have no direct influence. If you ask me about indirect influence, then I'd have to say perhaps, and it's principally due to the way that public polls, and when I say public polls, those polls who are purchased by news organizations are used. No surprise to anybody in this room that news organizations are much more a participant in the process today than they ever have been. It used to be 20 years ago, 40 years ago, the news organizations were observers. And they are now more and more becoming participants in the process, for better or for worse. And polling is there's a very clear example of how they are participants. For one thing, there are more polls out there purchased by news media organizations. 1984, for example, there were only 42 public national polls about the presidential race. In 1988, there were 124. 1992, there were over 250. So basically, you have a situation where almost every Tom, Dick, and Harry news organization that wants another story is going out and buying a poll so they can create a story. Now, politicians, we know, have been misusing polls for years, although they've been principally the public news organizations' polls that they have been misusing. But we now have news organizations misusing polls. There's two major areas how they're misused. One is in basically uncritical reporting of findings and naive reporting of findings. They don't necessarily understand that a poll done on Tuesday doesn't mean Tuesday before election, things might change by election day. A lot of volatility out there, and the reporting is as if the poll was done today instead of a week ago. The other thing that news organizations are doing, which is a potential problem, is they're oftentimes using polls to shape their coverage. I think anybody can make a case for horse race type coverage, but more and more news organizations are shaping their stories around what their polls tell them. I remember an article from the Oregonian prior to the primary on the contenders for city council, and the article about Charlie Hales, who at that time was 20 points behind in the polls, started off in the first paragraph, Charlie Hales' struggling campaign, who he's 20 points behind in the polls, and then basically went on to talk about Charlie Hales. I mean, what impact that does to a candidate's campaign is, very hard on campaigns when that's the way you're treated. There was a lot of reasons why that 20-point why the fact that Charlie points being 20 points behind should not have entered into news coverage. Primaries are very volatile. They are talking to all voters. Only 50% of the voters showed up, so forth and so on. Even when they talk about what their poll says, the poll may not be accurate for a variety of reasons. And many of you remember the Oregonian polling in the primary. They were wrong almost every race they polled in. I guess I'd have to say they deserve what they get. But it's not only the case in Oregon, but all over the country, more and more news organizations, and I think probably television stations and networks are the greatest violators of basically shaping coverage on the poll. And if you're going to spend $20,000 on a survey, you don't want to waste your money, so you've got to get something out of it, and so that's the reason. In summary, let me go back a minute to the whole process area that I talked about. We saw that people were happier with the process and the election, at least at the presidential level this year. And so what did that mean? I think the most important fact that came out of that is we had more people vote in this election, a higher percentage of the eligible voters vote in this election at any time since 1968. And you recall, 1968 was the last year that we had 21-year-old voting. 72 was the first year we had 18-year-old voters, and it's taken that long to get the 18-year-old voter into the system. Studies have shown that basically more people turn out and vote when they're disturbed about what's going on in the country, and I think this is a major reason why you saw the higher vote this year. With that, I'll stop, and Tim and I are here to answer questions.
And we'll have our first question from Eva Parsons. Jim Kuhn will have the second question, and then I would invite you to line up behind the microphone with all your questions. Eva?
My question is, given the high voter turnout, as you referred to, especially among younger voters, how can we keep the momentum going and keep their participation in government going, especially in a way that will result in greater confidence in government?
Well, I guess the best way to do that would be to continue to have a perceived economic crisis in the country to turn people out. That's not a very good way to go. I agree with what Bob said on that. I do think as younger voters get older and get into their 20s and they become more invested in the system, whether they become married or become homeowners or get rooted in a community, they tend to have more investment in a community that way than they would when they were 18 or 19 or 20 or 21 or more footloose. So I really think part of that is simply going to be a process of maturing and of younger voters setting those roots down. The other thing I would say, though, is that I think news organizations and all of us who are involved in the process would do well to continue to remind voters that, to not to paraphrase Ross Perot, but basically be involved in your community, be involved in your country, in the affairs of your country, whatever your political beliefs may be, because I think that's a healthy thing. I think that the turnaround in the trend of downward voter history this year is, to me, the most encouraging thing, regardless of who won. I think that's the most encouraging thing that came out of the election.
Eva, I'd have to say that I think I agree with Tim. The stake in the system is what brings them out. I'm not sure we want to create an economic crisis every 4 years to get them out, though. The other thing I do want to say is Tim asked me to tell you that he didn't do the Oregonian polls in the primary.
Nor did Bob.
Tim, you indicated that negative campaigning works, citing Bob Packwood as an example. Do you believe that in the national scene, negative campaigning worked in that Bush was talking about bozos and so on, and Bush came out second best?
It doesn't work in every case, and I should say that it doesn't work. If both guys run negative campaigns, only one guy who runs a negative campaign is going to win. And I do think that President Bush's campaign was a much more attack-oriented campaign than Governor Clinton's. One way that it makes it tougher for a negative campaign to work is that if voters perceive that you have failed as an incumbent, it's more difficult for an incumbent who is perceived to have not done a good job to run that kind of a campaign and survive. So I would say the Bush campaign might be more of an exception that proves the rule. And negative campaigns, not every campaign is negative. I thought that Mayor-elect Katz and Commissioner Blumenauer ran a pretty good quality campaign here in Portland. But I think you're going to see, because of the stakes that are involved, the amount of money spent in these campaigns, I think you're going to see more of this kind of trend in the future and not less of it. But that doesn't mean it works every time. The Packwood campaign, I should say, and Bob did the polling for it, as someone who worked in campaigns for 14 or 15 years and was involved in them, I think that was strategically the best campaign I've seen in Oregon in a long time. Bob Packwood was 25 points behind a year ago in our polling, and while Les LeCoyne helped him a great deal by having a checking problem, Packwood, whether you like what he did or not, he ran a magnificent campaign.
Ted Kay, City Club member. There's big issue this year, as in the past, about exit polling and projecting results before the polls are closed, both in the national arena and the state arena. Would both of you comment on your opinions about the issue, and especially KOIN TV's decision to buck the trend and set an example for the rest of the stations?
As Packwood's pollster, the exit polls we saw on Election Day scared us to death because they had a coin winning 53 to 47. I guess I would go back to my other remarks. I don't believe that exit polling on Election Day changes anybody's mind on how they're going to vote. And I even seriously doubt whether it impacts the turnout. As I said, if there's anything I've learned or been impressed with in the 12 years I've been in business is how independent-minded the voters are, and don't tell me what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it myself and make up my own mind.
I'd like to add a couple things to that. First, it seems to me that I agree with Bob on exit polling. I don't think it should be released before any state's polls have closed, and I don't believe that any of the networks did that. But I'd also add that I hear, that the voters out here say, well, we're disenfranchised because we know the results of what's going on back there. Well, you can either turn your TV off and not listen, or it seems to me that a more simple solution is simply to have a uniform poll closing law in the country in which all the polls in the country close in the same hour. And of course, I greatly fear that if Congress has been incapable of doing that over I don't know how many years, I don't know how they're going to fix our other problems. But that's the best solution to me. Now, we did projections for Channel 2, and everything we did was based on results after the polls had closed. So once people have voted, I mean, it seems to me that while I realize it might take some of the suspense out, especially for losing candidates, it seems to me the quicker that we can say X is won or Y is won or this measure has won or lost, that's all the better. I don't think that many viewers really want to stay up till 11 or 12 or 1 in the morning hearing the kind of the droning on of election results. I think many people want to know who won and what happened, and then they can go to bed or turn to another channel.
Arnold Kogan, member of the City Club. I'd like both Tim and Bob to comment on the extent to which you think the primary race that Les Aucoin had with Harry Lonsdale, the extent to which that hurt Aucoin and helped Packwood in the general election.
I think the principal benefit of the primary for Packwood was that Aucoin was forced to spend his bankroll and was never able to recover that. In terms of public opinion, I'm not sure that the primary had much impact one way or another, but chiefly just the loss of financial resources for Aucoin was his major problem.
I would agree with that point, but I would add two others quickly. To me, I divide this race into BC and AC, before checks and after checks. Before the serious Aucoin checking problems became known, he was well ahead of Bob Packwood. Within a week afterwards, the race was even. As a matter of fact, I think that it was proved to be even by a poll that Senator Packwood released showing that Les Aucoin's 20-point lead had disappeared. I do think there was another tactical problem for Aucoin, and that is that he was tattooed day in and day out by Harry Lonsdale on these issues that he was vulnerable on, and then also beaten up again in the last several days by Senator Packwood prior to the primary. And I think those things had to have some residual effect as you rolled into the fall. So I think it helped set up Aucoin better for the fall election. But I agree the biggest problem that it caused him was that he used all his money up that he'd expected to be able to save for a general election. That is, Aucoin used his money up.
I'm not sure he even would have won had he had the money, but that was his major problem.
Michael Wells, City Club member. As I understand it from talking to some other people, we've sent a more liberal president and more liberal Congress to Washington, but at the state legislature level, not only in Oregon, but throughout at least the West, it's, if not increasingly conservative, at least it's still conservative. And on ballot measures, it's been very anti-tax and in general status quo or conservative. Can you talk about that dichotomy, or is that true?
I'd start with that. Anyone who thinks that this electorate was in a liberal mood and wanted to elect liberals is probably an ideologue. That's not what happened. This was a change-oriented electorate, and George Bush, pure and simply, was found to be rightly or wrongly, not up to the job, or voters perceived they were not getting what they want out of him, the choice came down to a choice of Bill Clinton or Ross Perot, and for most voters that choice was clearly resolved in favor of Bill Clinton. We did not send a more liberal Congress. We sent more women to Congress, certainly, and there were a lot of changes in that respect, but the Republicans actually gained congressional seats. They didn't lose seats. They gained about, what, 8 or 10 seats on a national basis. I doubt very seriously if the Congress as a whole, the House of Representatives, will be more liberal than it was last time around. And I'm not sure, some Democrats on the left would argue with the definition of Bill Clinton as being a liberal as well. So
I have to concur with Tim. I think change was the real driving message out of this one. You look at the ballot measures, the two that passed, one was term limits with offers change, also the change in the Metro Charter. I think in Salem, basically, people don't like the way state government is running, which means Barbara Roberts, the top of the ticket, so they wanted to send the Republicans down there to, change the way things are done in state government.
Frank Munjum, City Club member. I'm interested in your thoughts on the poll you released Monday on our views on replacement revenue in Measure 5. On one hand, it showed that the majority of Oregonians supported or believed we needed replacement revenue, and at the same time, the majority also said they would not support any new taxes. I wondered how you would reconcile that seeming contradiction.
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. Believing that we need new taxes and being willing to pay for them are two different things altogether. I'm not, I have my own view on this, and Bob may be different, and I know other pollsters who are good, reputable pollsters may have a different perspective. I think the chances of passing a tax reform measure which includes a sales tax in this state in the next several months, maybe next several years, but at least the next several months, is almost nil, maybe 10%. I just don't think people are convinced that government has become more efficient. I don't think that they're convinced of what they would need to be convinced of to get the thing through. Now, my view is that if the Measure 5 cuts really kick in and voters begin to personally feel pain, and I didn't realize it would do that. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea that we did that. Then you may begin to see a shift in climate. It's clear that people are not entirely easy or are happy with what they've done with Measure 5. There's a lot of uneasy and a lot of cutting, kind of cross currents cutting. But the one thing that was consistent was when you tried to pin them down on specific tax reform programs, nothing got a majority. And my experience with 14 years of these things is if you don't start with a majority in your polling, you don't usually go up. You usually lose support as people take a better look at it and buyer's remorse sets in and they decide, well, gee, maybe this is a good idea, but it means more money, or how do I know the government's not trying to shaft me? So if you don't start with a higher level of support, you're in a lot of trouble.
I just have to add reinforce what Tim said, but basically the voters don't buy into the idea that there's a problem yet. And I think some of that was created by the reaction of the whole government structure after ballot measure 5 passed, rather than try to buckle down and do something about it, or at least be perceived that they'll do something about it. They basically were moaning and groaning, we can't do this, we can't do this. Everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket, and a year went by and basically nothing has changed and taxes went up. I don't think the conversation furthered public's realization that there is a problem, and I think that just basically a lack of leadership at all levels of state government has really hurt any possibility of getting any sort of reform through. And until somebody or some group take charge and start leading people, or until people feel enough pain, nothing's going to change.
Jeff Tashman, City Club member. This may be a related question, but this split roll property tax initiative allowed a lot of people the chance to vote for somebody else to pay taxes. In view of that, what were the factors that led to it being so soundly defeated?
Well, I wasn't involved in either side of the campaign, but I think that basically the campaign that the opponents of that tax put on suggested that maybe it won't be just taxing somebody else. Maybe you'll also wind up getting taxed. As a strategy, when I was involved in those campaigns and was looking for a no vote, that is a no tax vote, we always tried, regardless of what the tax was, to make it clear that you, the voter, regardless of what they say, may wind up getting stuck with some of this. And that's a message voters are very receptive to hearing. They're tremendously skeptical of government and tremendously suspicious of government that seems to always be coming back and saying we need more money.
I'd have to concur. I think the voters just thought they were going to pay in the long run anyway, and so it'd be no saving.
Walt Roberts, City Club member. I'm interested in what you think about a third party, about an independent party, or multiple parties emerging now, and what you see, if that indeed does happen, comments about what the dynamics of a multiple party situation would be in future national and more local, the phenomenon of more local level.
Well, my first reaction is you think we've got gridlock now, you know, a third party or more. I mean, you've really got a serious recipe for gridlock. It's never really worked very long in our system. I think if we look back in history, we see the most common occurrences or potential occurrences have been when we weren't threatened from outside the country, we weren't threatened, but basically when domestic problems, you know, held forth. You know, I go back to the 1800s after Andrew Jackson, when we had a whole series of one-term presidents. And when the Democratic Party was falling apart during the slave and the Republicans were rising, you know, there were a number of parties. Again, it was domestic created chaos, which I think, you know, it looks a little bit like that now. I don't know if we're certainly not to that point, but there certainly is, there are the seeds out there for a third party or more. But whether or not, I mean, if Bill Clinton, after 4 years, is perceived doing something about the deficit, I think he'll probably erase that need, or if he can't and we get some more charismatic leader who people, you know, sign off with, I think that whole threat will go away as well.
I would agree with what Bob says, but I also have a little bit different perspective in that I think a third party potentially could be very healthy depending on what kind of a party. If it's a party of a radicalized center in a positive way, I think that's a good thing for the country. If it's a party of extremist perspective on either way, then I don't think that's a good thing. But you really raise a good point. Again, you could have a cottage, you could spin out 50 scenarios, and it may well be that none of them will wind up being what actually happens. I think the most likely thing is that we won't have a third party, but no one talked about that as a live possibility after 1988 or after 1980, and it is being talked about genuinely now as a possibility. I do feel that when people have gotten to the point where they perceive that the system is not responsive to them, you're going to have these kinds of things occur. And if you basically, I really do feel if you do have a perceived failed or nearly failed Clinton presidency and the Republicans are in a fractured kind of situation or cough up the likes of Pat Robertson or Pat Buchanan, who is a very narrow, whose support base is very narrowed, I think you could see a new coalition form. I would say I don't necessarily think it's bad that a third party would form if it was a party with a broad base and a potential governing ability. But those are tremendous handicaps for them to attempt to overcome. But I view what happened with Perot this year as very much a warning, a big league warning sign to the two-party system. And I very much hope Bill Clinton has a successful presidency. But I think he's got a tough row, and I think if he doesn't make it, the likelihood of a third party is strong. Or fourth or fifth party, too, I might add.
Jim Francisconi, City Club member. You raised the issue of need for leadership for tax reform in this state. And I'd like to ask you a question about the role of you as pollsters and the question of leadership with your candidates. And specifically, what is the line? I mean, when you're talking to your candidates about polling in order to arrive at certain positions versus leadership to kind of go in a certain direction to educate public opinion. I mean, where's that line, and what kind of discussions happen in the real life of politics along that?
Well, I guess I view myself primarily as a reporter of public opinion. This is where the public is on what they know about you, what they don't know, how they feel about the issues, what they feel most strongly about, and I see that primarily as my role as a pollster. As far as candidates, I mean, I can think of very few who went out and did a poll and then decided how they were going to vote or what their position was going to be. Most of the people that I've worked with in the 12 years I've been in business have very strong feelings on a whole variety of issues, and polling has nothing to do with it other than to help them find out what parts of the state or what particular groups they ought to talk to, or, you know, if one thing's more important than something else.
I would agree with what Bob said. I would add that, again, being retired from doing actual candidate campaigns and ballot measures, I didn't view it as my job to tell some candidate, either he or she, to go immolate themselves, suggesting that some tax issue basically was that I didn't want them to go wipe themselves out on an issue that they had no chance of winning on. My job, and I viewed it that way, and I don't think Bob would disagree, was within the ethical standards to get my candidate elected or to get a measure passed or defeated. I did not view my standard as saying, gee, Senator X or Congressman X, we all know we need tax reform, but nobody wants it. Why don't you go out and stick yourself on this at the head of this one-horse parade and get 22% of the vote in the general election?
I'm Nat Israel, City Club member. I haven't heard anything today about term limits. I'd like to know what you feel, whether voters would be more involved or less involved.
More involved or less involved with term limits. I guess I think the voters will remain involved or not involved regardless of whether we have term limits or not. I mean, I see some good points and some bad points about term limits. But as far as, voter involvement, I don't know that I see term limits having any impact on that. Perhaps it could open up the system more so more people get involved in running for office. Maybe that's one area.
I don't have anything to add to that.
I'm Herb Crane, a member of the City Club. For the past several elections, I've listened to the two of you and enjoyed the meetings immensely. I find you extremely compatible. You support one another on almost all of the issues, and it's quite revealing. The only question that raises in my mind is, why is one of you a Republican pollster and the other a Democratic pollster? Aren't pollsters the same?
Well, that's not true. In the first place, when I worked candidate campaigns, I worked almost exclusively, but not exclusively, with Democrats. I never considered myself a Democratic pollster in the sense of saying that my job was to produce information to make Democrats look good. Further, I'm no longer a registered Democrat, so.
I'm a registered Republican and have been, and my sympathy lies in that direction. However, there are some good Democrats out there, I do realize. But in our business, if you want to poll outside your own state, you have to work one side of the fence or the other. You can't work both sides, or the national party organizations will not hire you. If I was to go to work for a Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate, basically I would be blacklisted by the Republican National Committee and others. So it's a business decision, although my philosophy is certainly, my sympathies are on the Republican side.
I'm John Ramig, a City Club member. One of the races that was most intriguing to me was the 1st Congressional District, where Elizabeth First beat Tony Meeker. And based on the polls I saw, that was a little bit of a surprise. And I'd be interested in your comment on what happened either late in the race or on the accuracy of a number of the polls indicating that Mr. Meeker was ahead in the race.
Well, we polled for Meeker on that one, and I can tell you that the Oregonian poll that came out a week ahead of the election showing Meeker 7 points ahead was accurate. That race changed in the week right up to the election. Things changed there. I think what happened there is that in the end, or what we saw in the polls, that all of the undecided voters, or most of the undecided voters, went to the Democrat, which is what we saw in most races this year, is that the undecided voters went more heavily Democratic than is usually the case. And a lot of the Democrats, beginning on about Wednesday before election, started coming home to their own party's nominee in all races. We saw that in the Packwood race, we saw that in the David Chen race for state treasurer, that for some reason or other, Democrats have been standing off until about a week before, and then they really started coming home in large numbers. I think it was just they were invigorated by Clinton and the desire for change, and it was more or less kind of just a tide that swept First in and Meeker out.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Hibbitts, I think you mentioned something about explosive growth. And explosive growth, I think, would conjure a picture of substantial increase in infrastructure investments. Given the people's taxpayers' feelings about taxes and money, governmental expenditures, and their presumable devotion to quality of life, how can all this shake out?
That's a good question. I think that governments in the area are going to have a very difficult job ahead. If this growth in fact occurs, are going to have a very difficult job ahead in convincing voters, taxpayers to pay for some of these things. Now, it is clear that voters are willing to pay for something when they think they're going to get a return on it. The light rail measure 2 years ago was a phenomenal example of that. Got almost 75% of the vote in the Tri-County area. But I think you're right. It's going to be very tough, and I think you may see a situation here much akin to some of the eastern or maybe California cities where the infrastructure starts to decay because either voters won't pay for it or can't pay for it.
Carlene Kraft, City Club member. I saw Bob Dole interviewed right after the election, and he said he did not believe that the election was a mandate for change, and that if he could keep the Republicans together and add in the Peroistas, as you call them, what are the chances of breaking out of gridlock?
Oh, I'll take it. I think that Clinton and the Democratic Congress will work together very well, and I think they'll produce legislation. I think the questions then become A, whether or not the legislation they produce really does us any good or simply creates another set of problems, and B, whether or not they wind up becoming ultimately tax and spend Democrats against. This was not an election in which people were endorsing being taxed more. You know, Bill Clinton was very disingenuous, I think, about some of his ideas in that respect. The reality is infrastructure investment is somebody's pork barrel. So how Clinton deals with that, and I'm not saying that's a good or a bad project, but how he deals with that and how the Democrats in Congress deal with that. I don't believe that Dole can obstruct to a degree, but I don't think he can stop at this point what the Democrats want to do.
I don't think Dole can stop what Clinton has to do if he's going to be successful. I see Clinton and the Democrats very easily passing a lot of jobs programs, social programs. I mean, that going through, you know, economy fixing type, temporary economy fixing things, I think are going to be easy with Clinton and the Democratic Congress. The real test for Clinton, as I think Tim said earlier, is he's got to be perceived having done something about the deficit. And he's going to need the Republicans to do that. And that's going to be the real question. Are we going to get out of gridlock or not? You know, are we going to take some steps to resolve the deficit problems? If we don't do that, we're not out of gridlock. Clinton's a one-termer.
Don Ballinger, City Club. I don't recall ever being called by either of your firms for an opinion. Who do you survey? How often do you change your sampling? And how do I get on your list?
Go ahead, Tim. You can.
Well, I'm actually surprised, given the amount of polling that's been done, that you haven't been called at least once. And what we'll normally do in a statewide survey is interview perhaps 500, 600, or 800 registered likely voters. And there are a number of ways in which we conduct or construct that sample. One is frankly to simply purchase a randomly generated list of likely voters. There are vendors who can give us that. There are random digit dialing methods where you wind up basically going through, in essence, the book or going through a list of numbers and calling folks on that basis. Most folks that I talk with, actually, of my friends, have never been called by a public opinion survey firm either, and yet I occasionally talk to people who say they were called 4 times in 1 week, and you got to wonder, well, what is it? You know, they must have good answers or something like that. But
luck of the draw.
Yeah, luck of the draw. But those are the ways in which we get at voters. It's not, no method is perfect, and I think depending on the survey, I think Bob would agree that we might use a different, somewhat different technique, and depending on the type of survey in the area we're surveying. But that's basically the way we get at it. And I will say, if you're not a registered voter and have no intention of voting, we're not, in almost every survey I do, I'm not interested we're not interested in speaking with folks who aren't interested in voting.
I have the same experience. I have numerous friends that have never been called, and I have no explanation why. As maybe we haven't got enough work.
If it would make you feel better, I could take your number, and the next time we go out, we could sort of especially call you on something. And it really wouldn't count since it'd be random, but it might make you feel better.
Carol Waters, I'm a member. I'm interested in your comments about the potential of Clinton failing, and particularly what you said just a few minutes ago. I think Tim said if he doesn't do something about the deficit and this whole mandate for change. I agree with that part of it, but I didn't see any polling, and would be interested if you did any polling that showed that the people who supported Ross Perot and who felt and/or felt very strongly about change and felt very strongly about the deficit, if there was any polling done that showed that they were in fact willing to pay 50 cents more for gas tax and some of those things.
I don't remember seeing any numbers either that showed that they would be willing to pay. There are, though, my guess is 35% that would probably tell you that they would pay if you were to ask the question. And maybe with some leadership, maybe more, but.
Hi. Barbara Clark, City Club member. I'm interested in the magic number of 500 for a slice of the population, and I've wondered what if you got 500 people together who were representatives, say, of the metro area, what would that be like? What would you expect to see?
At one meeting?
Or imagine if you,
Are you
getting them to attend would be logistically
is your question,
impossible.
if we put a 500 sample of voters or representative citizens in a hall like this, what would it be like?
Well, I know it wouldn't be like this group. What would it be like?
Well, roughly half would be men, half would be women. A third would be age 18 to 34, a third roughly 35 to 54, a third 55 or older. You'd have
more Democrats.
Yeah, in the metropolitan area, certainly more Democrats than Republicans. About 91 or 2% would be white. What else?
Income distribution.
Just basic. It would be representative of the actual population out there.
How's that for income distribution?
Income distribution. Oh, again, it's going to be a little different if you're talking voters versus general public, because voters are older and somewhat more income.
Most would be in the 30 to 50.
Yeah, it's 25% are going to be $50,000 plus voters. Probably 25 in the 35 to 49, 25% in the 15 to 34, and 25 less than that.
Thank you.
Well, the election may be over, but judging by the turnout here today and the number of questions that we had, certainly the interest is still very high. I'd like to thank Tim Hibbitts and Bob Moore for joining us today, and we are adjourned.